Okay, so in the last set of notes we looked at narrative inquiry and we looked at case studies. This set we're going to do phenomenology, grounded theory, and
the what's the third one there? Let's see.
ethnography. And like I said before, these approaches, we're presenting them as distinct approaches. In practice, there's actually quite a bit of overlap, and a lot of the time researchers will combine them in a pragmatic way. The first approach that we're looking at is phenomenology. Phenomenologists ask, what is the essence of X experience? Usually their focus is broader than it would be in a narrative inquiry or a case study, which is usually specific to just that case. Johnson and Christensen began this chapter discussing the Columbine massacre of 1999.
Give me something that I could hold on to, then I'll stop shooting at you.
Most of the text throughout the entire play is taken from records and journal writings and police reports and interviews, tons of interviews. It's real people's words, and they've just kind of lifted those and put them into these fictional archetypical characters.
I'm at a shopping mall when my wife calls. I'm thinking it's probably some kid mad at another kid, took out a gun and shot him. So I jump in my pickup and turn on the radio, and the announcer's just sobbing, saying that up to 30 kids have been shot. I start doing the math. 1,800 kids. I got Rachel and Craig in there. What are the chances, right?
We don't expect people to come out and sit down with a bucket of popcorn and turn their brains off. For this 2 hours, we want people to come sit down and engage with us as we talk about a serious problem that is affecting our society.
Now, researching Columbine in itself would be a case study. However, if you wanted to research the experiences of school shooting survivors, that would be phenomenological. Since Columbine, we've seen many, far too many school shootings. And as researchers, we might want to find out about what is the essence of the experience of living through such a horror, and the aftermath. And why do we do this? Because doing this kind of research can raise important questions and issues which might not otherwise be discussed, but which may be very important in forming policies and practices for responding to these events. Compared to doing other kinds of qualitative research, phenomenology usually includes more participants, though still significantly fewer than a typical quantitative research study. The reason for this is so that researchers can gain a holistic understanding of the experience or phenomenon. When you're looking at a case study, you want to find people who are associated with just that case. When you're looking at phenomenology, you want anybody who's experienced the phenomenon in a kind of more general way. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, if you want a holistic understanding, and all participants have unique experiences, doesn't that mean that you have to study every single person in the world who has ever experienced that phenomenon? How would you even accomplish that? Your study would never end. What qualitative researchers aim for is called data saturation. Let's say we're looking at the experience of taking this class online, Let's say there are about 600 students I've taught research methods to. That's kind of a rough estimate. And we can assume that everyone who has taken this class has had a unique experience of this class. Everybody's got their own lives and their own backgrounds and everything else that they come to this class. But I don't want to sit down and interview all 600 students. I don't have the time to do that. And I imagine probably many of them don't want to sit down and be interviewed by me. Fortunately, what tends to happen with most phenomena is that after a while, the stories that students have to tell about the class start to become minor variations on basic narrative. Some students love the class, some hated it, some liked the way I taught, some didn't. Maybe one of them lives in Manhattan, Kansas, maybe one of them lives in Munich, Germany, right? So there's a little bit different context, but the stories are probably fairly similar.
Anyway, like I was saying, shrimp is the fruit of the sea. You can barbecue it, boil it, broil it, bake it, saute it. There's shrimp kebabs, shrimp creole, shrimp gumbo, pan fried, deep fried, stir fried. There's pineapple shrimp, lemon shrimp, coconut shrimp, pepper shrimp, shrimp soup, shrimp stew, shrimp salad, shrimp and potatoes, shrimp burger, shrimp sandwich. That's about it.
So when we reach the point where all the stories start to sound more or less the same, that's called data saturation. Getting additional accounts doesn't significantly add to our understanding of the phenomenon of, taking this class. EdSep 816 is demanding. It would be maybe one of the themes that would emerge, and probably would carry across most students' experience of this course. Your specific experience of this course being demanding isn't going to alter my understanding that this is a demanding course. But things to keep in mind is that qualitative research is about a holistic understanding, not just finding the points of agreement. We want to capture the experiences of multiple points of view. If there are students who thought the course was easy or not challenged, we also want to represent them in the report, as well as those who found it demanding. In fact, when I came up with the, EdSep 816 is demanding theme, I might actually actively seek out people who disagreed with that statement and get their perspective. That's called negative case sampling. And we should also be very careful and tentative about the way that we present our conclusions. Data saturation is a point at which the researcher judges that it's unlikely that new experiences are going to contribute to the understanding of the essence of the phenomena. However, we always need to be ready to admit that it's possible that another account exists somewhere, that differs from what we found, that could provide a totally new perspective. We can never be 100% confident that our findings are entirely comprehensive and exhaustive. There's always more data out there that can potentially change everything. But from a practical perspective, at some point we do need to finish a study and publish, or, write our dissertation and graduate. And that's not limited to qualitative research, that's true of all research. There's always more data out there. Traditional phenomenology is interested in the essence of the experience, the phenomena in itself. Therefore, it's important to bracket out all subjective interpretations so that we get at the meat of what the phenomenon consists of. Bracketing basically just means accounting for one's subjectivity in order to set it aside. If I'm interviewing murderers on death row, I need to set aside my values about, murder and, the death penalty. So that I can investigate the essence of their experience of, awaiting death penalty. I'm interested in their experience in itself, not necessarily representing what I think of their experience. So bracketing becomes sort of a form of transparency. When you're writing up your research, usually you have a section for qualitative studies where you describe the subjectivity of the researcher. And that's a way of accounting for it. I mean, if you knew somebody with anger management issues, for instance, would you rather that they deny them and act as if those issues don't exist, or acknowledge them openly and take responsibility for managing them?
Serenity now!
Bracketing is sort of like that. Interpretive phenomenology is kind of a newer approach, and it says that the essence of an experience is always subjective. The phenomenon doesn't exist outside of our perception of it. The tree falling in the woods makes no sound unless somebody hears it. Now, we still need to account for our subjectivities, all of the values or the political beliefs that we have, but the assumption is that they cannot be removed or separated from understanding the experience of a phenomenon. They're part of that experience. Attempting to bracket them is itself a subjective value that influences the way the phenomenon is experienced and can be kind of a bias. So phenomenology looks at essential experience. Ethnography is about studying cultures. And before you engage in any kind of ethnographic research, it's important to ask yourself, what exactly is a culture? Now, if you don't have a neat and tidy answer to that, I wouldn't feel bad. Anthropologists have been working on this question for a long time, and they haven't really entirely answered it either. But we can start with this basic assumption. Culture is not just a matter of food and music and clothing. That's a terribly reductive way of presenting a culture, but it seems to happen a lot, However, you can't understand anything about what it's like to be a Canadian by putting on a toque, drinking a Molson, and listening to Rush, or eating poutine.
The daytime so he gets high on you, and the space he invades, he gets by on you.
All of those things are very awesome, though.
Hey, welcome to the Great White North. I'm Bob McKenzie. This is my brother Doug.
How's it going, eh?
Okay, our topic today is the Great White North, because we got lots of mail, about it, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, so this
By
is
the
it.
way, this topic was my idea, eh?
Yeah.
What?
Lying. Okay, this is the Great White North, okay, on the map. Now here is a different color because it's like USA. And up there, same color as Alaska, because that's like Hawaii. Okay, so the whole thing is the Great White North, and the blue, like the ocean, right, because water's blue.
He's a genius, eh?
For a general working definition, let's describe culture as the shared beliefs, values, attitudes, ways of being, and experiences of a particular group of people that bring them together. However, if we use this definition, this is where we run into problems, especially when you approach something as large as a country, Canada or the US. What does it mean to be Canadian? As a group of people, Canada may be too large to study. What is it that unites Torontonians with people in rural Alberta, with Francophone Maritimers in Nova Scotia, or First Nation tribes in the Yukon territories? They're very diverse groups of people, and each of them represents sort of a distinct culture to themselves. So, like with a case study, it's important to draw a boundary or distinction about what is and is not part of the culture. So for most modern, ethnographic researchers, in order to keep their studies manageable, they'll study distinct, subcultures. So for example, instead of studying all of Canada, I might decide I want to study, Vancouver punks.
But it's so cool that we're together and we're smiling, drinking soda. I want to jump in a lake, sun shining down on a beach in the summer.
Right? There's a thriving punk scene in Vancouver. So what are the values or norms or attitudes or beliefs or experiences that define what it is to be a Vancouver punk or Van City punk? Something that's important to note about ethnographic research is that it requires the researcher to spend a prolonged time in the field, embedded in the culture. Typically that's defined as a minimum of 1 year, so it'd be 1 year of hanging out in Vancouver with a bunch of punk rockers. It's not just a couple of interviews here and there. Researchers need to gain a deep familiarity with the culture in order to represent it authentically.
Got no place to go. Let's go to the punk rock show. Darling, take me by the hand. Gonna see a punk rock band.
When you don't spend an adequate amount of time, you don't get that insider perspective. You get kind of the tourist perspective. It's limited and in many cases is artificial. There's actually a classic essay by Joan Didion called Slouching Towards Bethlehem, in which she describes the neighborhood in San Francisco, I guess Haight-Ashbury, with all the hippies in the 1960s. And I think that is a pretty good example of maybe like some ethnographic research. She was embedded with the hippies for, an extended period of time and got to know all of them and hang out with them.
In the end, she will surely know I wasn't born to follow.
Related to ethnographic research is the emic and etic perspectives. Emic refers to the insider view. That's really kind of what you're after with the ethnographic study. The etic perspective refers to more of an outsider perspective. Generally, ethnographic researchers want the emic perspective. However, in the old days of anthropology, The etic or objective kind of outsider view was the predominant approach. And that's what was taken by researchers who were primarily European men who went to these exotic lands, to study primitive cultures. And if you just think of the words sort of exotic, primitive, and things like that, you can see how they made sense of the people who were living there who were neither exotic nor primitive, in their own experience. These are labels or descriptors that are imposed on them by the researchers. And this detached and scientific view of ethnographic research ended up resulting in a lot of Eurocentric notions and fed, and in some cases continues to feed, quite a few prejudices and stereotypes and discrimination. I think the idea of going native is over-exaggerated, in my opinion. But researchers shouldn't lose sight of their own positionality in the research. I could spend 3 years hanging out with, Van City punks, but I am not personally a Van City punk. As much as I'd want to understand the culture from an emic perspective, I'll never completely, truly be one. I'm always going to be me, from Toronto, and I was never a punk. I did buy a few punk CDs, though.
Hey, oh, let's go! Hey, oh, let's go! Prominence and go to the top one. The kingdom is the landmarks.
Another reason to be aware of positionality is because if we accept that realities are socially constructed, then my person is going to influence the way that the research participant presents themselves to me. For example, I read a study in which a principal was interviewing students, at an alternative high school. And while the researcher had the best intentions, they weren't trying to punish them or, get the kids in trouble or anything, he was still, an adult and an authority figure. Therefore, he would have a different kind of relationship to the participants than, let's say, one of their own peers. And when I was working with recovering addicts, as a counselor, I knew that I would be more trustworthy to them in jeans and a t-shirt than I would in a suit and tie. I can change my clothes to kind of fit in and adapt, but there's limits. The other researcher can't change his age. So we should be able to account for the way that ourselves influence the participants in the construction of data. So grounded theory research, if you remember back to the first chapter, we talked a bit about the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning.
I'd rather be a forest than a street. Yes, I would. If I could, I surely would.
Quantitative research tends to be grounded in deductive reasoning. It tests theories and hypotheses. Grounded theory, on the other hand, uses inductive logic to create theories or hypotheses. These theories aren't usually like major things like the theory of gravity, but more low-level theories describing kind of what's going on here. So for example, a grounded theory study might ask what characteristics create a positive academic advising relationship. And you might start by observing a number of advising relationships or interviewing advisors and advisees. As you get their accounts of positive advising experiences, you can start to formulate sort of a theory about what makes for a good advising relationship. Then you continue to collect the data, and using a method of analysis called constant comparison, where you're always going back to check, how well the data matches the theory that you've developed, and how well the theory matches the data that's emerging, and then continue to revise your theory as you go. And then once you reach a point where collecting new data doesn't help you revise the theory anymore, then you've hit what's called theoretical saturation, basically data saturation. Now, Johnson and Christensen say the next logical step is for the theories to be tested using quantitative methods, and sometimes that's all right, but for most qualitative researchers, they're not really necessarily interested in quantitative validation. Qualitative research is not in service to quantitative research. Okay, so let's move from the approaches to sort of a discussion about data analysis in qualitative research. You've collected all this data, you've got pages and pages of interview transcripts and analyzing, observation data and all this other stuff, right? And I'm going to give you kind of a typical generic way of analyzing the transcript data. But there's a number of other approaches, so this is not like the only way to do it. First of all, I would recommend transcribe your data yourself. Okay, if you've recorded, an hour interview, yes, it takes a long time, and yes, it's kind of tedious. But doing transcription allows you to pay very close attention to the ways that your participants are talking, and allows you to get close, to the data. That's what they say, close to the data. You're paying kind of a lot of attention to what they're saying. Once you've transcribed all of the data, then you'll do sort of another read-through just to get a general sense of what's been said.
There was madness in any direction, at any hour. You could strike sparks anywhere. There was a fantastic universal sense that whatever we were doing was right, that we were winning. And that, I think, was the handle. That sense of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. Not in any mean or military sense. We didn't need that. Our energy would simply prevail. We had all the momentum. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west. And with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark. That place where the wave finally broke and rolled back.
You want to make yourself very, very familiar with the data that you've collected. After that, you're going to go back and chunk the data. And chunking is a process in which you break apart the transcript into basic segments of meaning. The level of the chunking depends on the needs of the research or the perspective of the researcher. Some researchers work at the level of sentences or paragraphs. If you're really hardcore into linguistic discourse analysis, you might work at the level of like phonemes or parts of words. You might also use a two-stage process in which first you identify hotspots in your data, things that are particularly interesting or relevant to your research question, and then chunk just those spots instead of, the entire transcript. I would recommend very strongly that you save an original copy of the transcript and save, different copies as you work through it instead of overwriting the same file over and over again. That way you've got a record of kind of what you've done in the analysis, and if you decide to go back, you can easily, revert back to an earlier copy. So do not delete your original data. So once your data has been chunked or segmented, then you begin sort of a sorting process. It's called coding. Usually this means giving each bit of data a descriptive label. Once you've coded the data, then you can begin categorizing or grouping similar terms. Through the process of categorization, you can combine and condense your codes. So for example, out of an interview, I might see something that says gone to the mall, and I might see something that says went shopping. And probably there are not significant differences in the meaning of those concepts. So I could combine them as shopping. And then I would look for other instances of shopping in the transcript. Now, as you generate, your list of these codes and categories, you can always return back to your original data, that's why you saved it, and see how well they fit by recoding, all of the data using, the categories that you've developed. And so you repeat this, over and over again. It's kind of an iterative process, meaning it evolves in cycles. You also want to be able to look at the relationships between different categories. So if I have a category of, shopping, and I have a category of driving, what might be the relationship thematically between those two things? And while you're doing all of this analysis, make sure you've got your research question in mind. Are these codes and categories actually helping you to answer your research question? It's very easy, especially with novice researchers, to get caught up in examining data that has nothing to do with your research question, just because you think it's kind of interesting. But you want to keep focus when you're doing the analysis. Now, Johnson and Christensen mentioned something about counting the frequency of codes. But frequency in qualitative research doesn't necessarily mean that what you're looking at is actually important. For example, I got really bored one day and I decided to do a word cloud, which is like a visual representation of the frequency count of words in a document of all the music that was on my computer. And the result of the analysis was that the Rolling Stones came up with more frequency than Nirvana. Now, I like both the Stones and Nirvana, but I actually prefer Nirvana over the Stones. The problem is Rolling Stones have been around forever, and they're always releasing albums, while Nirvana only released, a handful of records during, the lifespan of the band. So as a result, I have more Rolling Stones music on my computer than I do Nirvana music, but I actually like Nirvana better. However, the word cloud was somewhat misleading. So frequency is not necessarily the best way to analyze qualitative data. Okay, so you've done the coding, you've done the categorizing, you've gone back and, looked at the data again, and so on and so forth. And then the next step is to develop, broad themes which describe the relationships between the categories. Usually in a study there's maybe 2 or 3 main themes that emerge from the data. And generally what you do when you're writing your article is you're going to present a theme, and then you'll present the ways that theme has been enacted in the data through, the categories that you found. And then each of the categories may be represented by a particular quote or excerpt that you've pulled directly from the data. So if my theme was leisure, right, and my categories were driving and shopping, then I would find, quotes from my transcripts to exemplify, how my participant experienced driving or experienced shopping. Sometimes new researchers or novice researchers in qualitative research get trapped by the idea that all of the data is important, but when we're presenting it, we need to be selective about what we're presenting. We need to kind of reduce this massive, amount of data that we've collected from our participants into something that's kind of a digestible version of their experience.
When you reduce the wine, what happens is the flavors concentrate as the water or an alcohol evaporates out of the product. So you have a really nice, strong wine flavor in your dish.
So you want to find like the juiciest or the most interesting bits and pieces, to present to your readers. And also make sure you're answering your research question. So those are 5 kind of basic approaches. Narrative inquiry, which is the study of stories. Case study, which is the study of a bounded system or a specific event, person, organization, or location. Phenomenology, which deals with the study of the essence of an experience. Ethnography, which is the study of culture. And grounded theory, which is the study of a process in order to generate a low-level theory. There are other approaches to doing qualitative research that weren't mentioned. Autoethnography is your own story or your own experience. There's ethnodrama, which is producing research as a play. There are other arts-based forms of doing research. Critical theory research, I think I mentioned in one of the notes, which deals a lot with like power and discrimination and social justice. So there are a lot of different approaches to doing kind of research, but these at least to give you sort of the basic, main 5 that are out there.